Hey everybody, Pastor Stephen Anderson here from Faithful Word Baptist Church in Phoenix, Arizona with part 12 of my life story. So in January of 2009, I preached a sermon called Barack Obama Melting as a Snail. And, nothing really big came of it. It was just another sermon, uploaded it, people listened to it, they liked it, whatever, moved on. Well, then later that summer, I preached just some really face-ripping sermon that dealt with the sodomites at some point. And so the clip where I was really ripping on the sodomites ended up kind of going viral online. And so I ended up being invited on some different broadcasts to talk about the sermon, including the Alan Colmes show. Now, Alan Colmes was this really liberal Democrat radio host, but he had a nationwide audience. So he brought me on his show for like an hour or something. And then once I was on the Alan Colmes show, then other liberal talk show hosts were having me on to basically argue with me and everything. And I was just doing it to get the exposure to my preaching. And so I ended up going on a bunch of these liberal shows to talk about my sermon against homos. Well, this spawned, other news articles and videos and things. And in this one article, they put at the bottom of the article, it was all about the homo stuff. But then at the bottom, they said, oh, by the way, he also hates Barack Obama, because I preached another sermon in August of 2009 that was pretty much like the same sermon I had done in January. It was pretty much the same material called Why I Hate Barack Obama. And so it was just at first a footnote in a bigger news story about me preaching against sodomites. It was just, oh, by the way, he also hates Obama. It was the final line in it. Well, then, MSNBC picked up on that particular part of it, and they did a video piece attacking me and saying how I hate Barack Obama. And obviously MSNBC's huge. Then it just started getting just picked up by other media outlets. So it switched from going after me about the sodomites to going after me about Obama, because they wanted to make it more like political. They always have their agenda that they're trying to push. And so CNN was the one that really just got a hold of this thing and ran with it. And they were just running stories about my sermon literally every day for like a week. There was this one particular host, Rick Sanchez, that in, whenever this was, like August, September, right around that time of 2009, he just kept on talking about this story, and he's interviewing other pastors to get their opinion. Like, he was just trying to find new angles for this story just to keep it going. So this just ignited a huge firestorm and a massive amount of persecution. It was a level of persecution that I had never experienced before. And so, at the time, it was very difficult. It was scary because it wasn't something that I was used to. So it was very stressful. Looking back, it compared to things I went through afterward, it wasn't really a big deal. But at the time, it really felt like a huge deal. The Secret Service came to my house. There was a warrant for my arrest at one point, but that turned out to be something totally different. It was a mix-up, and it was just super stressful, super crazy time. And of course, CNN is just totally lying in their story. For example, a bunch of protesters came out, and this was also the first time that we got protested, and not the last. But a bunch of protesters came out, and there were probably, I think I counted like 35 or 40 protesters on a Sunday morning. And our attendance that morning was 50 in church. I counted the attendance, but then also the CNN reporter who showed up that Sunday morning and was outside filming and talking to people, she counted too. And she asked me, she said, how many people did you have in attendance this morning? I think it was actually 49. I said, we had 49 people. And she said, oh, good, that's what I counted too. I was counting people on their way in. But then when it makes it on the news that night, it's, oh, he only had 20 people in his service. And there were 100 protesters, when in reality, there were actually more people in the service than protesting. They're just like, oh, yeah, his church is tiny. It's mainly just his family. It's like 20 people max. And, 100 protesters. And they're just twisting everything. Later, I talked to the lady from CNN, and I said, why does he lie like that? I said, you asked me how many people. You counted yourself. Why did he say there's 20? And she's just like, I don't know. It's not my fault. I'm not the one who lied. But, that's just the way things work or whatever. And by the way, the reason I was talking to her is because she was inviting me to come on the show live and talk to Rick Sanchez. So I said, yeah, I'll come on the show. I'll talk to him. A few hours after I talked to her, I get a call from this guy, and I hadn't announced that I was going on CNN or anything. I didn't see any public announcement about it. But this guy calls me up and says, if you go to that interview, I'm going to kill you. And he said, you better take this seriously. This is not a joke. You better take this more seriously than anything that you've ever taken in your life. If you show up to that CNN interview in Phoenix, you will be killed. I will kill you. And I didn't know if it was real or fake or whatever, but I just said, you know what? Screw you. I'm going to that interview. So do your worst. But then I get a call like 2 hours later canceling the interview, saying, no, interview's not going to happen. Then Rick Sanchez goes on the air that night on CNN and says, oh, we're trying to get Pastor Anderson to come on the show, and he won't come on the show. He refused to come on the show. Just blatant lies over and over again. So we're getting all kinds of like hate mail, death threats. My phone was literally ringing like every 30 seconds or something. There'd be like 3 calls coming in. I knew there was call waiting, but I'd never seen like 3 calls coming in at the same time. I was like, wow, I didn't even know my phone had this capability. And so just emails are coming in by the second, phone calls, physical mail, death threats, envelopes with white powder spilling out of them, human feces, used contraceptives. I mean, it was just insane. Finally, I ended up tasking Brother Stuckey and another guy. I said, hey, I'm dealing with too much right now. You guys have to go through the mail, because we had to go through the mail because, some people are sending donations and checks or letters of support and stuff. And so I just told them, I said, this is a nasty job, but I need you guys to just help me out with this and go through the mail and, throw away all the hate mail and gross things that are being sent to us. And so, they did that for me to help me out. So I was upset. I was stressed out, worried. People from my past, like people from my childhood, are just calling me up out of the blue that I haven't heard from in years, just to tell me what an idiot I am and how evil I am. And so it was just insane levels of persecution. It was very difficult at the time, but it also just totally messed up my business. Okay. So I lost most of my customers. And just to give you a little background on my work situation and finances, when I started the church in 2005, December, like I said, my finances had been thrown for a loop. I didn't expect to be starting the church at that time. And when I bought my house, they had all these hidden fees that we didn't talk about. And so I ended up being like $11,000 in credit card debt when I started the church. And not only that, but when I bought my house, it was like the worst time to buy a house because it was top of the market, but also there was a lot of predatory lending going on. And so, I had a first mortgage of 6.5% interest. And then I had a second mortgage with 10.5% interest. That I bought my house for like $225,000. The market would crash a couple years later. It would drop to like $80,000 in value. But I wrote it out and eventually sold it for a profit. But I had this, $180,000 financed at 6.5%, $45,000 financed at 10.5%. I had 11 grand on credit cards. And so I ended up continuing to work for my boss from Chicago. And, I was actually doing really well financially because I started a branch out west of his company. I was making really good money. And so I was able to pay all that stuff off within the first few years. I was able to pay off my credit cards, within like 3-4 years. I was able to totally pay off that second mortgage just with an extra 45 grand just from making so much money doing fire alarms. I was able to pay off the second mortgage, pay off credit cards. So that was a huge blessing from God. I was really happy about that. And I was not taking a paycheck from the church at all for those years of, 05, 06, 07, 08. I wasn't getting paid whatsoever. So fast forward to 2009. In 2008, I ended up quitting working for my boss because his Illinois branch of things was just losing money and having all kinds of problems. And so I ended up breaking with him and starting my own company in 2008. Then I was making even more money. And so I was really, by 2009, just making money hand over fist. I paid off debts and everything, doing great. But then when this whole persecution came about over the Sodomites and then Obama in summer of 2009, then I ended up losing virtually all of my customers. I had one good customer left, but then several months after that, I lost that customer. So this was devastating to me financially. Thankfully, I was in a good position financially, but, what was I going to do going forward as far as making money? Because by early 2010, all of my customers had dropped me, except I had one customer that was just tiny, insignificant customer that gave me like $200-$300 of work a month or something. But I lost all my other customers. And so, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do going forward for work, because the church was still small. The church is running like 40, 50 people, and it wasn't big enough to support a full-time pastor at all. So what I decided to do was that I was just going to work for the church for free, because I still had money coming in from the fire alarm business. The way things worked was that in the fire alarm business, commercial side, it took 90 days to get paid. And 90 days is when they think about starting to pay you. So when I lost all my customers and my business was devastated, I wasn't making any new money, but I still had like a backlog of money that the customers owed me. And they owed me around $40,000 total. So I thought to myself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to work for the church full time for 6 months, not take any pay from the church, but just that's going to be my job every day. And I'm just going to live off that $40,000, because I was like, $40,000, that I can live off that with my family for like 6 months. And then my idea was at the end of 6 months, hopefully the church will have grown enough to where I can be full-time pastoring at that point. Because I'd never, really put all my energy into the church, because from day one of starting the church, I was working a secular job. And I was spending more man hours on my secular job than pastoring the church, because my job was really demanding and I had to make a lot of money to support my family, get the church off the ground, and so forth. So I was like, if I put all of my effort and all of my energy into church for 6 months, hopefully that'll make the church grow enough to where I can actually just be a full-time pastor. So for 6 months in 2010, that's what I did. I was, doing a ton of extra soul winning. I was putting out way more content online, videos. I was just working on church stuff all day long because my fire alarm business had totally dried up. Well, at the end of 6 months, I had basically achieved no results as far as the church growing. The church had grown by 5 people. So attendances were like averaging 5 people higher, which is what I felt like it probably would have grown even if I weren't full-time. So I was like, wow, I put in all this extra work. But, I did end up getting like a lot more salvations and putting out a lot more content. But the new church members just didn't materialize in the short term. And so at the end of that 6 months, I had worked and worked and worked, and the church had barely grown, still only running like 50 or whatever. And so I was trying to think, should I go get new customers for my fire alarm business, or maybe I should just get a job doing fire alarms working for someone else? Because I felt like if I got new customers, am I just going to lose them again? And then I'm kind of like wasting my time with that. So, I decided I'm just going to get a fire alarm job working for someone else. So I started working on my resume. As I'm working on my resume, my phone rings. And it turned out that my best customer, my biggest customer, had actually been bought out by another company. And so they call me up and they're like, hey, I'm looking through the records and it seems like we used to use you all the time. Like you were just doing hundreds and hundreds of jobs for us. But then all of a sudden we just quit using you, 6 months ago or whatever. And I don't know why we quit using you, because it looks like you did a good job and everything. Like, are you available for work here? And, can you do these jobs for us? And I'm like, yeah, sure, let's go. Because it was a new company that had taken over the old company. They'd been bought out. So I get off the phone and I was like, man, this is awesome. But then I was like, I should probably talk to him, because I don't want to get all into my business again and then have it, fall apart in a day or two or a week when they figure out what's going on. So I pick up the phone and I call and I talk to the guy in authority down there. And I said, look, let me just explain what happened. In addition to running this business, I'm also a preacher. I'm very conservative. I said things that offended the previous ownership. It had nothing to do with my work. They always loved my work in regard to fire alarms, but it was just that my preaching had bothered them. And the guy's just like, well, we don't care about that. We just want you to do the work. And I'm like, great. Well, then we're in business. And so it was just amazing how God worked that out so perfectly, because I lost all my customers, just worked for church, just doing church stuff for 6 months. And then as soon as I was to a point where it's like, okay, my money's gone, I need to go get a job, it was like God just stepped in, literally like I'm working on my resume and God steps in and says, nope, here you go. And so it worked out great, because that one big customer came back. It wasn't as much as I had going on before, but it was enough to where I could work half-time for church and half-time in the secular world and make enough money. So that was starting in 2010. I think it was like late 2010, where I started taking like a half salary from the church. So between getting a half salary from the church and doing about half of the business that I needed to do, I was able to get by. And it was actually good, because it was more sustainable level of travel. It wasn't as insane as before. I was making less money, but I also wasn't having to work such a crazy schedule. And it gave me more time to invest in church and spend time doing church stuff, being home more with my family. And so I was able to continue doing that throughout 2011 and 2012. And I believe, the first half of 2013. And really the money that I made took me all the way through the end of 2013. And so that was a blessing. God just, stepped in right when I needed him to and helped me out with that. At the end of 2010, in December, my daughter Anna was born. So that brought us up to 6 kids. And then in 2011, it was just, pretty much a quiet year, as I recall, just preaching my sermons. I kind of found a nice life-work balance with my fire alarm business, church, family, much more sustainable schedule. Kept on farming social media, putting up a lot of content, preaching my sermons, making money at my job, and, everything went pretty smoothly. So the next really big thing that I would point to is After the Tribulation, being produced in 2012. So let me explain how that came about. Going back to 2010, I'd had this idea about making a pre-tribulation rapture documentary, like a documentary exposing it as a fraud. And there was this guy that I knew that we called 4409. His channel's still on YouTube, RP4409. But this guy made a lot of just hilarious videos. He was a big part of the Ron Paul movement, freedom movement. He was with the Freedom's Phoenix guys. And so, he had a name, but we just called him 4409 because that was his YouTube handle. And so he had put together like a 25 minute documentary exposing Schofield. And so I had seen his work on that. And I thought to myself, I need to team up with this guy and put out a film against the preacher of rapture. So while I was thinking about that and working on that and talking to him about that, Paul Wittenberger ended up showing up at Faith Forward Baptist Church in 2010 just because he had listened to a bunch of my preaching and he'd become a big listener. And so he showed up in 2010 with Michael Murphy because they were working on the film What in the World Are They Spraying? And then I think he came by again in 2011 while they were working on The Great Coaling. And so Paul then showed up and he said that he wanted to make a documentary exposing the pre-tribulation rapture. And I was like, great, because I'd already wanted to make one. And Paul Wittenberger was a filmmaker of a higher caliber anyway than 4409. And so I was like, oh, wow, you know, we can make this like a really serious production here if I work with Paul on this. So we ended up starting to film the movie at the beginning of 2012 because he still had to finish up his other project with, you know, the fluoride film, the chemtrails film, the other stuff he was working on. So we started filming at the beginning of 2012. I preached a big sermon about it. He filmed interviews of me about it. And then later in the year, you know, he came out and filmed again. And by this point, we had moved into like a bigger, nicer building, still in the same complex, but just bigger. And, you know, we had a new mural and everything. So then he came and filmed the rest of After the Tribulation. And I was still working my fire alarm job half-time at this point. I was still traveling on. So sometimes I would travel to LA and I would go over to Paul's house and watch like rough cuts of the film and you know, sit with him while he's editing and talk about the film and everything. And so I ended up getting a little bit involved in the production of that film, but it was probably the film that we made that I was the least involved in because, you know, I was still really busy with work and everything. But I did get involved in enough to where he ended up giving me a co-producer credit, you know, for that film. And then we ended up releasing it on December 21st, 2012, because I had the idea that that was the end of the Mayan calendar. It would be a cool date to release the film. 12/21/12, and it's the end of the Mayan calendar and everything. So we kind of hyped that up. We released After the Tribulation. It was immediately for free on YouTube. And Paul had offered me money or offered me like a cut of it. And I just told him, no, I said, I don't want any money or anything. I just want to be able to distribute the film for free. As long as I can just hand out as many DVDs as I want, as long as it's going to be free on YouTube, then, you know, that's all I want. That's all I care about. So that was always our agreement with all of our films, in fact. So we did that. We came out with the film. The first few months, it did pretty good. Like, you know, got like 60, 70,000 views or something. But it didn't really go crazy until like 4 months later, Alex Jones picked it up. And so I got to go on the Alex Jones show promoting After the Tribulation. He started to sell it in his store and everything. That's when it just went nuts. And that's when it got into the millions of views. Ultimately, in the long run, it would get over 15 million views on YouTube if you include the Spanish version, because the Spanish dubbed version of it actually got more views than the original English version, if you can imagine that. So After the Tribulation just ended up being just, you know, obviously a huge film, huge success. And so I started working on putting together like a really comprehensive, definitive Revelation series. And I really took this seriously because I wanted to nail down everything about Revelation. There were a couple of things that I wasn't really sure about, and I was like, man, I'm just going to spend the time and study and pray and talk to other people and get to the bottom of this and really do a good job, because I wanted this Revelation series to be able to stand the test of time. I didn't want to have to go back and revise it and change my view on things. And thankfully, I can say that in 2026, my 2013 Revelation series, I still stand by virtually every single word of it. You know, it's definitely very accurate. God has used it to get just multitudes of people saved. I mean, I'm constantly running into people who say that they got saved as a result of that Revelation series. So I was like, you know what? Let's do the definitive Revelation series. So I went through and, you know, memorized the book of Revelation. Every single day for months, I would go through the entire book of Revelation every day, either reading it or reciting it, just studying it. I spent hours and hours on the phone with Dr. Roland Rasmussen, who was in his 80s, but he was really big on Bible prophecy. And so he had been the one that had won my parents to the Lord back in the 1960s. They got saved at his church, Faith Baptist. And he personally got my dad saved. And so I would spend hours on the phone with Pastor Rasmussen, and I'd spend hours on the phone with my other pastor friends and just people that I respected their views on prophecy. I studied and studied and said the two things that were bothering me the most were the 144,000 and Revelation chapter 12. So I really dug in on those issues, and I ended up being really happy with the answers that I came to and really satisfied. And I feel like God really answered my prayer as I was begging him every day for understanding and clarity and wisdom so that I could really do a good job on that Revelation series. So like I said, we released After the Tribulation in December of 2012, and then right away we started filming the Revelation series in 2013, January. And Paul did not yet live in Phoenix. He still lived out in LA. So he basically had to come out to Phoenix. And so the idea was we were just going to shoot the entire 22 hours of the Revelation series over the course of a couple weeks. You know, he would come out, we'd film the whole series, and then he'd go home and edit it and release like one per week or whatever. So, you know, some of these were going to be preached in Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night services. But obviously that's not going to get us 22 sermons. So I had to preach also just sermons on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So it's just this grueling schedule of just preaching an insane number of sermons. And I'd spent months and months working on it, getting the material ready, making sure I understood everything. So on the days that it wasn't a church service, we just invited whoever could come down from church to kind of be there and just sit in the front row. That way there'd be some heads in the shot, but then it would cut to B-roll from the Sunday services and everything. And so, you know, it ended up seeming like I'm always preaching to a big crowd, but a lot of those Revelation series sermons, I'm only preaching to like 10 people or something, you know, and then it cuts to the shots where I'm preaching to more like, you know, 80 people or whatever, because the church was still not very big at that time. But, you know, I want to say around that time, you know, running like 80 or something. So I ended up getting into this, and it just started to physically take its toll on my body. And I started just feeling sick and feeling tired and everything. I was just trying to push myself, though, to, you know, preach these sermons. Well, I preached the sermon on Revelation chapter 1, and I just didn't like the way that it had turned out. You know, I've preached maybe like 2/3 of the sermons or something, maybe half the sermons. I don't remember exactly, but I preached more than half of them actually. And I just did not like the way chapter 1 came out. And I was thinking chapter 1 is the most important chapter, because if people don't like chapter 1, they might not even finish the series. You know, chapter 1 is where they decide whether they're going to stay with it or not. And so I told Paul, I said, I've got to redo chapter 1. And so I go to redo chapter 1, and I forgot my outline at home, and I was going to go home and get it. But I was like, you know what? Last time I preached from this outline, I did a bad job. I said, maybe God caused me to forget the outline at home, because maybe I just need to preach this off the top of my head. Maybe the outline is messing me up. So I decided to just preach chapter 1 with no notes, just from the heart. And I start preaching, and I get, you know, maybe 2/3 of the way through the sermon, and I really liked the way the sermon was going. I felt like the sermon was really working. I was really happy with it. I was thinking like, yeah, this is so much better. I'm really glad I redid this. But then all of a sudden I started to get like severely physically ill while I'm preaching. And so my guts are just churning and rumbling, and I'm just in a bunch of pain. And I'm just like, I am not going to stop this sermon, because the sermon was going good. It's already my second time. I've got to finish. So I ended up just pushing through the sickness and the pain, finishing Revelation chapter 1. And I kid you not, as soon as I finished, like, in Jesus' name, amen, I ended up just running to the bathroom and just being sick in the bathroom. And then I came out of the bathroom, and I told Paul, I said, you know, I can't continue. I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. Like, we're going to have to just finish filming the series another time. Just go home and edit what you've got, and you're just going to have to come back in a couple months or something, you know. You got a lot to edit. And so that's what we ended up agreeing on. And I think we'd finished about, if I had to guess, I'd say maybe we'd finished like 14 chapters, and we had like 8 to go. So he ended up going home without filming everything. But I just, you know, I'd physically just kind of given it everything I had. So he came back a couple months later and ended up finishing. And of course, the Revelation series was a big success. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views online, still popular to this day. So then for the next documentary, because we wanted to keep going because we were succeeding, I had written out an outline and planned a film exposing Mormonism. So I really wanted to do this documentary about Mormonism, and I'd been studying and researching and planning it. But then somebody ended up donating a large amount of money to Paul to make a film about the King James Bible. And so because that's, the money that came in, Paul said, hey, let's do this King James film. That seems to be what people are interested in and what I'm getting the donations for. So then we decided we were going to do New World Order Bible versions, which is the next film that came out. So After the Tribulation was 12, Revelation series in 13, and then New World Order Bible versions ended up getting released in 2014. I'm going to leave it there for now, and we'll pick up in 2014 next time. God bless. Have a great day.